this America First agenda could end up costing the American consumer quite a lot of money.
So tariffs, just tell us exactly what they are designed to do and why Donald Trump thinks it will help the American economy and bring down prices for the consumer there.
Yeah, well, the last bit of that is a bit of a head scratcher for most economists. But it is, look, there's lots of things that tariffs can do, especially if you've got the perspective of Donald Trump. He thinks that the US has reduced, we remember that we started about 50 years ago with lots of tariffs on everything. All countries sort of didn't like the idea of selling from other places when they buy from other places when they could be making things themselves. And it took a long time to persuade them to do all these trade deals where you lower your tariffs, your taxes against imports if other countries lower theirs.
Yeah.
And we got to the point where they're now very low. And Donald Trump thinks that the US is kind of being taken advantage of by all these countries that have very low costs and possibly have, may have higher tariffs themselves. And it's harder to sell to China than it is for China to sell to America, for example. So he sort of thinks America ought to go back to having higher barriers against other countries and getting more out of other countries for access to the US market. He also wants to encourage all these American businesses who've sent a lot of production overseas to bring back jobs and factories to the US. If you're America, you probably can get away with this just at least to some extent in a way that you can't if you're the UK, because the US really does have a big market. So even if it's still, depending on how you measure it, either the first or the second biggest economy in the world, it's certainly one of the richest economies in the world. If other countries put barriers up to US exports, well, they don't export that much, and they do have lots of US consumers who will buy American goods. So this kind of America First approach, has got some benefits for the US. It's not very good for the rest of the world.
Right.
So that's one thing he's trying to do. He's trying to get jobs back to the US and punish people for doing the wrong thing.
Do you think that manufacturers will move the jobs back to the States?
So one of the things that he doesn't get, or at least doesn't seem to fully kind of care about, is the fact that you've got lots of US companies, manufacturing companies, who use imported widgets and things as inputs into their goods. And actually in the first Trump term, when you had you had these tariffs on China and on steel imports, for example, because he wanted to protect the US steel industry, actually it was pretty bad for US manufacturers overall because they all used a lot of steel. So you're helping a very small part of the economy, the steel industry, and you're hurting a much bigger part of the economy. So he actually lost manufacturing jobs in the US the first time around. And I think most people would say there's likely to be a negative impact on the US of the new round of tariffs that he's been promising, including on his kind of tweet late night posts on Truth Social last night.
Yeah. So this is going to disappoint a lot of people who've found the last 4 years really tough economically and have put their faith in Donald Trump to make things better. It sounds like potentially they could get a lot worse.
Well, it's interesting, right? So the economy's been getting better. So he's inherited an economy that is not that bad. And famously, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were trying to persuade people on the stump, on their campaign, look, things are actually looking up, things are better. So it could be that things will get better of their own accord, despite anything he's doing. I would also say, and you may have noticed, there's been a massive kind of market rally, lots of investor enthusiasm around Trump winning. And that too will sort of, he's boosted the sort of animal spirits in the US economy. So I think in the short run, he could get people might feel that things are getting a bit better. But you're right that the group of people who are dissatisfied with the state of the economy have been dissatisfied for a long time. And, we're pretty fed up with Trump at the end of Trump 1, and then Trump fed up with Joe Biden, and now are quite likely to be fed up with Trump again in 4 years' time. So it's very hard to make these people feel who they are. These people who are struggling in the modern economy, they're not being reached by anybody's policies so far.
Any word at all from the authorities in Canada and Mexico? And we know the Chinese have said something, haven't they?
Yeah, so the Chinese are quite sort of they've already sort of feel like this is all going to be bad news for China, and they've been trying to talk up the benefits of an open trading system to anyone who listen. We are told that Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, immediately got on the phone with Donald Trump last night after he put these posts out saying, hang on a minute, there's almost nothing goes across the border. We certainly don't have very many, much illegal trade going over the border in Canada. And by the way, we're working very hard with the US authorities to stop the fentanyl and all these excuses he had for tariffs. So it's possible, I don't know, I don't think he's a big pro-Canadian, but it's possible that he might relent on Canada. You remember he also did a big trade deal with Canada and Mexico, which this would pretty much violate. So it's not entirely clear he could even put these tariffs on. But Donald Trump doesn't always care about those kind of niceties.
And what about the European Union and indeed the UK?
So he's not said anything, in the last 24 hours about them. We know that he's got the EU in his, he's focusing on countries that sell more to the US than they buy, basically have a deficit or a surplus, have a big surplus with the US. Funnily enough, the UK in goods, which is what Trump cares about, actually has a deficit with the US. So we actually buy more US products than we sell if you're just looking at goods. That's not the case for the EU. So there is a possibility, there's a world in which he imposes tariffs on the EU, but not on the UK.
And
Who
just,
knows?
yeah, okay. And just to explain, just in general terms, if you have tariffs imposed on your goods, the goods you export, are you then likely to cut your prices to make life easier? Is that what's bound to happen, or does
Well,
it not work?
No, that's the interesting thing, right? So do you, and his claim has always been, so when economists say, look, you're putting a sales tax on goods, so you're going to be raising inflation for US consumers, you're not going to help the US doing this. His implicit response, or at least his defender's response, has been, well, no, because we'll see the sellers, the exporters will, as you suggest, will kind of take it on the chin and try and keep their price the same in the US and maybe take less profit. That is what happened in China. And we also, with Chinese goods that had tariffs last time, we also saw that the goods that he chose for tariffs, that he put taxes on, were ones that it was easy to swap out of. And they actually did that on purpose because they just wanted people to buy US goods instead of Chinese goods. What he's talked about for the second term is actually much more sweeping. So it'd be harder to avoid higher inflation if he's just imposing it on lots of consumer goods and things where it would be hard for people to absorb the cost. So that is what we're watching. But for what it's worth, most people think he's not going to do it all in one go. He will. Part of this is about having a negotiation because he always, he likes to talk about his deal-making ability. He holds this out as a threat, and then he does the best deal that's ever been done.
Yeah.
As he will always describe it.
Donald Trump has said that he will put tariffs on Mexico, Canada and China from day one in office. The president-elect will charge 25% on all goods coming in from Mexico and Canada and 10% from China. Politico's White House and Washington reporter Daniel Lippman told me this will be no surprise to voters.
He has been making lots of noise about these tariffs since day one of his campaign. And so the real question is, if this is a negotiating tactics, is this going to be a temporary tariff? Because will Canada, Mexico, and China go to his White House on day one and start to negotiate and so those tariffs can be lifted? Or do they try to negotiate during this transition? Even when Trump is not doing too much negotiating with foreign leaders, he's really more focused on staffing up his own administration.
The headline, of course, is always very attractive, especially to people who voted for Donald Trump. America first, tariffs on China, Mexico and Canada. What's the actual kind of practical result of this, though? What difference would it make? And how would America make up the shortfall, if there was one, in terms of those goods coming in?
Well, America buys billions of dollars of goods from Canada, Mexico, and China every single day. And so a lot of Americans' cars are made in Canada. We're buying tons of agriculture products from Mexico. We're buying tons of electronics from China and lots of other different things. And so while Trump says, oh, the foreign countries will pay those tariffs, it's actually consumers mostly, because they just raise the price and to try to benefit domestic manufacturers. And unfortunately, because America is living in a very globalized world, you can't just kind of unwind that globalization very easily. And so it's not like there's lots of American companies that are waiting in the wings to jump in on this opportunity. And so it is fairly ironic that if these tariffs go forward, then Americans could see a lot of inflation, more than they already have. And that's a big issue that Trump won his reelection on, blaming the Biden administration for raising prices. And so if he does the same thing with these tariffs, then he may pay a political price in the midterm elections.
And does he ever try to argue that, especially when it comes to something like cars, that's actually something that should be manufactured more in America?
That's his big argument. And you have to look at the last 30 years of American economic history in terms of, we thought that by opening up America's economy to interaction with China on a much grander scale, on other parts of the world, that would lead to greater prosperity for the US. And it did to many Americans. But to people who are actually making stuff with their hands in the Midwest, globalization has not really paid off very much. And so those are people that J.D. Vance especially talks to, people who are downwardly mobile economically. And you've saw tens of thousands of factories have shut down in America since the start of NAFTA, which is the free trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada.
25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, 10% on China. He talked about these, didn't he, during the election campaign, Donald Trump? Did you anticipate that they were true plans for Donald Trump and something that he intended to bring in the day he became president once again?
I think we always expected that Trump was serious about tariffs, not necessarily literally what the plans will be, and these aren't necessarily the exact how it will work out. These are slightly different to the plans he said on the campaign trail, where Mexico was going to get 10% along with the rest of the world, and China was going to get 50 or 60%. This is slightly different. They keep varying, but he is serious. He likes tariffs, and we're going to see tariffs from the US in the next 4 years.
Let's take them each country individually. We'll start with China, because that's the one that we've been talking about for such a long time on the World in 10. When he talked tariffs with China in his first term, it was about deficits. Not this time, is it? He's changed his tune about really with all three countries, but let's go with them individually.
It is still about the deficit with China. It obviously is as well in this particular case, talking about fentanyl. That's been an ongoing issue for the US with the China relationship for some time. But it is still about the belief that China is cheating in trade. By importing a lot from China, the US must be losing. That needs to be rebalanced. That's very much at the heart of Donald Trump's thinking. I don't see that changing. But remember, in the end, he did a deal with China first time round. So though I don't think the thinking will change, we have yet to see, but we expect that he will be open to making deals.
And that fentanyl, that he's talked about with China is also part of his thinking behind these 25% tariffs that he wants to impose on Mexico. He says that a lot of the drugs, these drugs are coming from China through Mexico, but also, about the border once again. It's been a focus of his really since day one of his entire political career, right? So was this a natural conclusion in your mind?
Oh, I think that when we were thinking among the trade experts about what Trump would actually do, Mexico was the one country nobody wanted to be in that sort of simulation. There's not just the problems with the border, obviously the fentanyl issue. The fact that Mexico has been building up its manufacturing capability, in some cases with Chinese companies investing in Mexico and then exporting into the US. That was never going to go down well with Trump, even though it was partly a result of the deal he did with Mexico and Canada in his first term of office. So Mexico's always the most vulnerable here. On the other hand, of course, Mexico also is the country that Trump needs to cooperate to control his southern border. So it's not entirely straightforward. So there's a number of different issues come together, including trade and security. So I suspect we'll see a bit of coming and going. This is not going to be a straightforward, I'm putting tariffs on, then we do a deal.
And we'll conclude quickly on this element by talking Canada and the reasoning for them. Again, in his first term, it was a job protecting policy when it came to a new deal really with Canada, wasn't it? This time, once again, I sort of struggle to know exactly what they've done. Is it, what are the issues around the border that he's so upset around?
Well, again, there are manufacturers who are based in Canada sending stuff to the US. Canada itself has thought that it could do a separate deal, so they had been speaking about basically jettisoning Mexico and saying, we'll do a bilateral deal. There may also be something personal in this that Trump famously doesn't get on with Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. He's probably on his way out anyway in the next elections. So there may be something political here. But in part, I think that Trump's view is if we're importing cars, that's wrong. And they do import cars from Canada and from Mexico.
Donald Trump isn't someone that usually admits he's wrong, does he? But he signed this USMCA deal, didn't he, in 2018, involving, the effectively free trade of sorts between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Is this a climb down by Donald Trump? Is this him going, I got it wrong? Or is it him just going, look, a lot's happened in 6 years, I need a rethink?
I'd be amazed if Donald Trump said, I was wrong in signing my agreement with Mexico and Canada. I suspect what he will say, if asked to justify this, is that he signed a perfect deal. Biden administration failed to implement it properly, so now he has to return and carry on with his work or something like that. Of course, actually, it will be his deal, and it will be that failed, and it will be that has to be reopened if he deals with these threats, because ultimately he tried to turn round the entire course of the modern economy, which is supply chains, and get them all coming back to the USA. That was never going to happen in Trump 1, and it's not going to happen this time round either, however much disruption he causes.
Now, you've been at the coalface of international trade negotiations, haven't you? So if you are Canada, Mexico, China, maybe even, parts of Europe, because the suggestion is this will impact pretty much the whole world if he carries out the threats he has made. What conversations are happening behind the scenes now? What warnings are being put to the US trade negotiators about the impact that this decision might have?
So there is in preparation, I'm quite sure in pretty much every capital around the world is a list of American products that are going to see tariffs on them should the US take action, and they will be seminal products like Harley Davidson, Jack Daniels, various things like that. So that's to be fair, that's the easy part. The next part that's more tricky is then what other stuff can we do that threatens US interests in various ways, things around services potentially. Maybe we threaten to shut down X stroke Twitter and attack Mr. Musk. On the other hand, then there's also the list that is probably here's the traditional things we can offer, like we can offer the US that we'll spend more on defense or we'll spend more on border patrols. And then there's another list, which is the ones for friends and family. Here's the things that we can do personally for Trump. We can, host major golf tournaments or at his premises or whatever it is. So there's all of these different lists in play, I think. And all these countries are just going to... Well, actually, I don't think they are going to be issuing warnings to US officials. I think they're going to be trying to keep their heads down and just make it clear that should they get caught up in a Trump tweet, there's a long list of things ways in which they've prepared. But I suspect you don't really want to do it unless you're very confident. There are a couple of people first time around who got away with this. Japan did it very well. Their prime minister went to have dinner at Mar-a-Lago. So they did okay, and the EU finally got its negotiation pretty well. But most countries, I think, hoped to try and avoid Trump in negotiations, basically.
On the surface of it, this is a story about Mexico, Canada, China, and the United States. Why is Germany commenting? Why is it a big story in the UK and in the wider Western world?
We're accustomed to 75 years of the US helping to build up the global economic system that we have today. And so it is a big deal if the US is threatening to pull back on that. Not only that, but that system is already breaking down with the rise of China. So there's a good deal of uncertainty around the world that we're going into in terms of trade. If the US pulls back, this is something we won't have seen for nearly 100 years. And obviously there's the fear of what happened then with the global depression. I don't think it would be the same now. The world is very different. But that memory as well, when the US pulls back, it's not good news for the rest of the world. If you're Germany, you have a huge trade surplus with the US, and you may be next in the firing line. Less so if you're the UK, but if you're the UK, you've spent all this time wanting to be an Atlantic bridge to trade with both US and EU, and suddenly that's not looking so easy. So everybody, all the traditional allies of the US have an interest in this, and just as I say, the history of it, that this does look like a historic pullback by the US. That's got to be a big deal.
Do you think he'll actually do this? Do you think that what he has suggested overnight on Truth Social is what ends up coming to fruition, or will there be enough pushback that he'll come? I don't want to say come to his senses. It's not for me to judge that, but that, in the minds of those that are upset about it, come to his senses.
What I'm expecting is that there'll be a lot of threats, quite a lot of chaos, some tariffs, some deals, and it won't quite be the worst, but it won't be great for the global economy either. So basically, somewhere between normality as we've come to experience it and the worst of Trump's plans will be where we land, but that won't be particularly good for anyone, even if we are slightly sighing relief that it could have been worse.
Can we dig a bit into the China situation? Because, Trump gets asked about tariffs all the time with China, but there are other issues potentially at play over the course of the next few years. Things like, will China invade Taiwan? Do you think that there's any thought in Trump's mind, look, if I really go for China in the immediate term, then sort of medium and long term, actually the global security situation might be safer, that China will be able to impact less, wars, for example, their support of Russia, their own intentions with Taiwan?
There are schools of thought that say that Trump's threats actually help security, that help bring European nations to their senses in paying more as well, that make people realize that there is an unstable world, and that somehow add an unstable world to a chaotic presidency and you actually get something positive out of it. For me, that sounds like a stretch. What I'm seeing in trade certainly is that with the US withdrawing, with the EU pulling back to a certain degree, you're actually leaving global competitiveness to China to take on, and that the US will have to reverse this in time. Taiwan's obviously a very different issue, but it's not clear really that what the Trump administration's view on China is. As similarly, it's not really clear what the view is on Ukraine. It is hard. We've got a situation where you get posts on the basis of being Trump loyalists, not necessarily for a coherent body of thought. So I think the idea that this all makes us more secure at the end of the day, or that the threats are carried out and the trade system survives, I think that's on the assumption that there's actually a master plan behind it, whereas actually I think it's a Trumpian chaos, it's a court system, and I think that that's the danger, is that you don't quite know where any of that is going, and that's what keeps everyone on their toes, but almost certainly that's not a good outcome.
And of course, in the last week or so, Canada has made this vow, hasn't it, to up its NATO spending to 2% of GDP, but not until 2032. of course, if these tariffs come in, presumably, I don't know if you can explain the depth at which that might affect a country's GDP. And then in actual physical monetary terms, 2% of that is going to be an awful lot less, which very much goes against what Trump usually would be calling for.
I mean, it's not a direct, if the tariffs go up by 20%, your GDP falls by 5%, but there is an expectation that trade wars are costly for GDP, particularly if the country retaliates, which you're under political pressure to do so. So the chances are that this does hit GDP. The chances are, now it has been argued that some countries might say to Trump, we'll spend more on defense, but we won't be able to afford to do so if you impose tariffs. So in order to do it, please don't impose tariffs. All part of the bargaining that I expect to see in doing so. But yes, I would expect some of the forecasts for growth next year to take account of the fact that tariffs are likely to reduce economic activity. Trade wars reduce economic activity.
So to all intents and purposes, you think, without going so far as to say for sure, that perhaps that this sort of Western security situation that people are very nervous about anyway at the moment is potentially at greater risk by these tariffs than if he doesn't impose them. Is that a fair reflection of what you're saying?
I think in any case, I'm more concerned about the security situation as a result of Trump than I am about the tariff situation. I'm more confident that the global trade system can survive because it's no longer as US-centric as at times in the past. I'm more worried about on the security side, and I expect it's just a fragmentation of alliances and of relationships rather than an outright breakage. But it feels to me like that can't be to the advantage of the United States, Europe, the G7 to have this situation of court chaos, if you like, and that must be to the advantage of other countries. That would be my basic view.
Just finally, David, bringing you back to a bit more generally, we've explored some of the potential wider ramifications, I guess, of this. Do you see, from Trump's point of view, that the phrase is America first, make America great again, isn't it, with Donald Trump? Do you see, just in isolation, how this does benefit America? The threat initially, and then potentially the carrying out of these tariffs. Does it truly, or has he missed something, Donald Trump?
There's an argument that says that in the kind of modern interlinked economy, the nation state has been left behind. And that in making these kind of threats and speaking up for the country, it provides something that you don't otherwise get of an element of confidence saying, look, we are still strong players. So, although we can look at the potential damage to the economy and to security, there is some kind of psyche here, underlying psyche, that does make a certain amount of sense. So I don't want to completely rule it out. I think we see it around the world that this element of, if you like, reasserting some degree of national control over a chaotic global situation, and it does require a Trump-like figure almost to do that, is what we've seen around the world. But usually the cost is much more chaotic, is much worse than the benefit. But I think that we've got to see it in that way, that there is a certain amount of nation building going on here as well.
Mexico's president has warned of possible retaliation after Donald Trump threatened to impose sweeping tariffs on imports unless the country halts the flow of illegal migrants and drugs into the US. The American president-elect Trump vowed to impose steep tariffs, 25% on imports from Mexico and Canada, with an additional 10% tariff on China. And he said he'd do so on his first day in office. Well, Trump has not spoken specifically about British goods, but Sebastian Gorka, Trump's chosen as his new counter-terrorism advisor, told Times Radio British people have nothing to worry about.
If you love your nation, then you will find common ground with President Trump. If you believe in Brexit and national sovereignty and the special relationship between 10 Downing Street and the White House, you'll be very happy at 12:01 on January the 20th, when my former boss will be reinstalled, God willing, as my future boss, and will take the oath of office standing on the steps in front of Congress. So if you were alive for the 4 years we were in the White House, then you'll know it was a golden era, and it will be even more splendiferous for the next 4 years.
Well, that was Sebastian Gorka speaking to Times Radio earlier. Douglas Carswell is president and chief executive of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. He's a former UKIP MP. He was also director of the Department for International Trade under Liz Truss. Joins us now from the United States. Good evening, Douglas.
Good evening, Carol. How are you?
I'm very well. Good to have you with us. What do you make of this announcement from the president-elect of these 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, two of America's closest trading allies?
I mean, tariffs are never good news economically. And even if you're a Trump apologist, I don't think you can pretend that there's anything ever good economically about tariffs. But I mean, the conventional wisdom seems to be that Trump is primarily talking about tariffs in order to address economic issues, and the feeling that America has somehow been too generous by allowing China and others to trade with it. I'm just not sure that that's necessarily correct. I'm not sure that what Trump has recently announced is primarily about economics. I think it's primarily concern about the border and concern specifically about mass uncontrolled immigration coming in from Mexico and Canada. And I would read the announcement of a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico as primarily a concern that Trump and the Trump team has about mass, large-scale immigration that is potentially going to change the demographics of the United States. And I think we shouldn't underestimate his determination to do something about that. So I think we should see this less in terms of being concerned about trade and more an issue of border security. I think it would be foolish to dismiss this as just a ruse. It would be naive to assume that he's just bluffing. No one really knows what his intentions are. But I wouldn't underestimate the seriousness of Trump and the people around him to stop uncontrolled mass immigration. They certainly don't want to repeat what they see as the mistakes of Western Europe over the past few years.
And the president-elect also said that China has failed to implement the death penalty for fentanyl traffickers. Fentanyl, of course, a huge problem across the United States. And he's talking about even bigger tariffs on Chinese imports. If he does go ahead and do this, and he says he's going to do it on day one in his latest post on his Truth Social platform, which is how he seems to announce many of his policies, what is that going to mean for the US economy?
I mean, it'd be very bad news. You just need to look at where a lot of US imports come in. For example, take petroleum, oil imports from Canada. If you put a 25% tariff on imports from Canada, you would put gas prices, petrol prices up very, very significantly overnight for the US consumer. You would have huge implications. I mean, America imports a huge amount of stuff from Canada and from Mexico. To put a 25% tariff on would have very disruptive consequences and inflationary consequences right away for the US consumer. But I don't think you should underestimate that. The conventional conservative view in America has always been that free trade is good and that tariffs are bad. And this has been the orthodoxy under sort of Reagan and Bush the elder and Bush the younger. What's changed with Team Trump is that the sort of the J.D. Vance view, which is that somehow tariffs are a good thing because somehow you can make your economic competitors pay the price of the tariff. I mean, this is certainly a sort of unconventional view. It's not one I agree with, but you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the people around Trump believe this. I think J.D. Vance would argue that if you were to put a tariff on Chinese goods, that would have an influence, an effect on the exchange rates to the effect that China would be paying the price. It's not a view I agree with, but this isn't really about what I think. I think the Trump team goes along with this idea of tariffs. So I think it would be very naive to think he's just bluffing just because he announces this on social media. He's had 4 years to think through what he's going to do if he's back in the White House, and I think he means it. I think unless the mass influx of illegal migrants across the land borders of Mexico and Canada is stopped, I really do think he will put a 25% tariff on.
And we've
Because
already heard from Mexico and Canada threatening that they will retaliate with slapping their own tariffs on goods which they import from the United States. Yeah. Where do you think Britain's going to be in all of this? We're already hearing warnings from some EU leaders that they should be ready for tariffs on EU goods going into the United States. Where does this leave Britain? Do you think we should be braced for tariffs on the goods that we send to the US?
If the UK government played its cards right, there is a very, very good opportunity for the UK to have, in effect, a complete tariff-free agreement with the US. Trump has this sort of almost sentimental, weak, soft spot for the UK. He's made it clear that he would be willing to cut some kind of deal so that the UK would be exempt from any tariffs that would affect the rest of Europe, the EU in particular. But it would require a willingness on the part of the current administration, that Starmer, to be willing to to come to the table. I think if Starmer wanted a free trade agreement with the United States, I think that is on offer. That is doable. That was never doable under Biden, but I think this could be done with Trump.
I mean, we didn't manage to get one last time he was in power, despite the fact that he was particularly pally with Boris Johnson. Why do you think it could be an option, or it could well be possible for Keir Starmer to get a free trade deal with Trump? To be fair,
the offer was there on the table. The issue wasn't Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. The issue was Theresa May. Theresa May, if you remember, was Prime Minister. She had the opportunity to have a free trade agreement with Trump, and she didn't take it. She was, as I'm sure you recall, intent on trying to achieve Brexit in name only and tie Britain as closely as possible to the European Union.
Well, that's another whole argument. We won't go back down that one, if I may. But just tell us why you think we could get a free trade agreement this time.
But it's important, Carol, to remember that it's the failure of successive British administrations, particularly Theresa May, to take an opportunity that's there on the table. That opportunity, I think, will be there again. One can't be 100% sure with Donald Trump, but I think the signs are that that offer of a free trade agreement, a comprehensive agreement, tariff-free agreement, will be there. If I was a government official in Britain now, I would be game planning what that might mean for things like rules of origin, because obviously if Europe had tariffs imposed on it, if China and the rest of the world had tariffs imposed on them, but Britain didn't, that would be a huge opportunity for Britain. But one would, I think, need to sort of start to game plan what that would mean for rules of origin and our relations with third parties, particularly given some of the trade agreements that we've made over the past 3 or 4 years. So, I mean, I think there is an opportunity there, but it would certainly require a little bit of humility on the part of Keir Starmer and perhaps his foreign secretary. It might be wise not to be insulting to the Trump administration. And it might, as Peter Mandelson, I think, rather wisely said the other day, it might be an idea to try and sort of leverage whatever connections Trump can with Elon Musk and Team Trump.
Through Nigel Farage.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm delighted that Nigel is in the House of Commons, but I think someone like Peter Mandelson might be the perfect person to try to make this happen. Certainly, talk to Farage, take his advice. But I think the opportunity for a Labour government that is Atlanticist to do a deal with Donald Trump, who, party politics aside, is a bit of a Britophile, I think the opportunity to find common ground is there. I mean,
and we'll have to leave it there. We are out of time, I'm afraid.
We heard a lot during the campaign, a lot of sort of shrill, what people might have called rhetoric about what he might do in office. But actually, it looks as though some of these things he's prepared to go through with. You mentioned the tariffs there on China and Mexico. On Canada and Mexico. Yeah. He announced that on Monday. That will be one of the first things he says he'll do when he comes into office, sign an executive order to make it extremely expensive for American importers to buy Canadian and Mexican goods, and also with China as well. Now, he's also had phone calls this week with Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, and the new Mexican president too. So I think what we might be seeing is quite a lot of public utterances just to sort of reassure those people that voted for him that, the America First agenda is still first and foremost in his mind. But he is at least, I think, reaching out to some of these people he's targeting and discussing, I think, in a bit more detail what he's planning to do, preparing them, and perhaps sort of talking about how things are going to be implemented. So, we're hearing a lot of public rhetoric, but maybe, behind the scenes, things are being prepared to, or the groundwork being prepared to make this as soft a landing as possible.
Yeah, and both Canada and Mexico have made it clear. Indeed, the Mexican president, his letter was published, reminding Trump and his America First team that two can play at this game. I mean, our economies are intrinsically linked. Huge imports go across the border back and forth, and it will also hurt you, they seem to be saying.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it does work both ways. I think it's more likely if Donald Trump carries through with the sanctions he suggested, sorry, the tariffs he suggested, it's more likely to be damaging to the Mexican and Canadian economies. But it will affect America, and it'll make a lot of goods and services that people buy every day that much more expensive. One of the things that he really criticized Joe Biden for, and then Kamala Harris, was the inflation rate, slapping sanctions tariffs on goods is likely to be inflationary. And that's before we've got to goods coming in from China and goods coming in from the European Union and elsewhere as well.
Right.
This America First agenda could end up costing the American consumer quite a lot of money.
I suppose he's hoping for more headlines like these. I don't know if you've seen the Financial Times for Friday morning, Alistair, but the headline is this: talk to Trump and buy American. Lagarde, as in Christine Lagarde, the head of the ECB, counsels European leaders. And there's a quote here. It says here, in her first interview since Trump won his second presidential term, she said the EU needed to, and I quote, not to retaliate, but to negotiate with the president-elect, who has threatened a blanket tariff of up to 20% on all non-Chinese imports. And so this notion of, hey, don't hit back, talk to him, that's what he wants, and buy American to please him. Oh, I mean, how's that as a bargaining chip, as a negotiating stance?
Well, I think it's quite a clever approach, really. Donald Trump is at his heart a negotiator, a deal maker, a businessman. And what anyone goes into a negotiation with is to offer outlandish terms, knowing that they're going to be chipped away at and bargained down and negotiated away. So I think that Donald Trump appreciates someone on the other side of the table negotiating just as hard back. And I think what Christine Lagarde there is saying is, don't do what I think politicians in the past may have had a tendency to do, which is to retaliate in kind. It's to sit down across the table and to thrash it out with Donald Trump. I think he sees politics as a pretty transactional game, and which is more likely to respect someone who goes toe-to-toe with him.
Yeah. And what about political scientists who are saying, one or two of them, senior ones in the States, are saying that Trump's mandate is not necessarily one for radical change? Because you would think, given that he won and pretty decisively, both in the electoral college and more narrowly in the popular vote, that he would feel I can do whatever I like. But there's a professor at Cornell University called Peter Enns who says actually voters haven't necessarily given him a mandate to make radical changes. You've seen that?
I haven't seen the particular quote. What I would say, though, is that I suspect that Donald Trump will waste not an iota of time worrying about what Professor Enns is saying.
Yeah.
He will say he won the election, which he did. He won the popular vote, which he did. There is no doubt in anyone's mind the sort of agenda that Donald Trump has. I think to suggest that he might have to taper some of his, what I imagine people think of his more sort of aggressive stances on things, just aren't really going to hit home. And Donald Trump is president for the next 4 years. He's got a Republican House of Representatives and a Republican Senate. I don't think that Donald Trump will feel as though he's going to be contained by very much at all.